Loren, thank you so much for joining us here at SuperReturn Global Infrastructure. You're here to talk to us about Joe Biden's £2 trillion plan. What does it mean and what are the realities?
Well, I think that we are going to see a significant amount of new money put into infrastructure this year. I think we've already seen, it's the plans that have been put out for new investment in the surface transportation plans that Congress passes every few years. What President Biden and his allies in Congress are proposing now is a significant level of spending above that. And I think that we are going to see more funding put in. My caution there would be that it's going to be probably less money than folks were expecting, and it's going to take longer to play out over time.
What do you expect to see? Because there is speculation that there's already sort of obstacles in place for this in terms of Republican opposition and things. What's the reality of what you can really hope for in the short term?
Well, there are two pieces of legislation that are currently being worked on. There's this bipartisan infrastructure plan, which contains a lot of the transportation infrastructure, particularly focused funding. And I think that bill is still very likely to be enacted later this year, probably about 75% odds. And I think that's important because that includes a lot of the rail and transit projects that the administration has been very supportive of, as well as work on broadband infrastructure. That is something that has gotten a lot of support from both of the political parties in the U.S. And as well as some highway funding, although with a focus on resiliency in particular, as part of the climate and environment agenda. So I think that's probably going to happen, although there are some headwinds there. There's a lot of political drama even with that bill. The other bill is the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill that the Democrats in Congress are working on. That's focused on healthcare and education funding and other social programs, but also a lot of money for environmental programs, a lot of tax credits for electric vehicles and other things to support green infrastructure and sort of general environmental protection. And I think that bill has gotten into some deep water politically. I think that probably there will ultimately be a package passed, but probably more in the range of $1.5 trillion. That legislation also contains tax increases that have been, politically divisive as well.
You do have a big hope that you mentioned there, the electric car aspect. Do you think that is something that is a reality and reasonably soon to happen?
Well, I think that on two fronts, both pieces of legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure bill as well as the reconciliation legislation, both contain important elements to support electrification of the U.S. car and truck fleet, both on the tax credits side for electric vehicles and then also for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Coupled with that, the Biden administration has a very aggressive regulatory program at the Department of Transportation, working with the Environmental Protection Administration to put through higher fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks, and that's a big lever for electrification. Now, the caveats for that, and there are several, are very important, and this is why it could take longer to play out, is that the administration needs to have a strategy for grid replacement. If you're going to have grid power for all of these electric vehicles, the administration's plan to replace fossil fuel energy production with wind and solar needs to be bolstered with, okay, we're replacing fossil fuels with wind and solar, but we're going to need about 70%, if it's the entire fleet, if it's a smaller amount, less, but you need to have actually more power produced by the US grid than is currently the case if you're going to power electric vehicles. And that's something they need to think about. They also need to think about retraining and retooling for automakers. They need to think about battery recycling as a major initiative. If you're going to have, say, 20% and then eventually 40% of the US fleet using electric vehicles, you're going to need to have a battery recycling program that's fairly aggressive in scope. You're also going to need to have a strategy for mining for the US to produce the rare, or be able to acquire the rare earth elements to produce the electric vehicle batteries.
You talked there about the supplementing of the grid. Is that something that really does need that bipartisan approach as well?
Well, I think most of that is handled on the regulatory side, meaning that President Biden can do it himself administratively, but it does create challenges because the members of Congress that are voting on the legislation, they see what President Biden is doing administratively, and that can create a political undertow, as it were.
Do you see there being more of an appetite for this change, though, across both parties in terms of the environmental events that we're seeing in the US, the fires in California, flooding in New York? Does that feed into the sort of public consciousness of a need for this change?
So I think that's one of the important things that we were talking about today. Is I think especially when we think about this side of the Atlantic Ocean, that it really is a very divided climate in the U.S. on environmental issues, and I think that there's such a lack of trust. I think that it's created a real headwinds for figuring out what is a consensus approach on these issues, and so I think that's been very slow moving. Although it is changing a bit.
Is there a positive in all that?
Well, the U.S. is continuing to emerge from COVID-19. I think you're seeing amidst a lot of the disruption that's taking place, we are seeing a lot of new technologies come online. I mean, technology is really going to solve a lot of these problems for us, whether it's on energy production, emissions controls, new technologies that will do things more efficiently and be great for the economy. And ultimately, there will be, new jobs as well. There's always a big, question about will automation be costing jobs for the economy.
Good to end on a bit of a positive. Thank you, Loren, so much for joining us. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.